Welcome to Life Story 999. Today's story dives into the powerful resilience of Nyla Mitchell, a woman wrongfully convicted and sentenced without cause. But when the judge discovers her true identity, the truth shakes the entire courtroom, revealing corruption at its core. Stay tuned for a tale of courage and justice that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel to hear more incredible stories like this. In the quiet tension of the courtroom, Nyla Mitchell sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed forward. Her expression was calm, her shoulders held steady, showing none of the fear or anger the courtroom expected to see from a woman facing a life sentence. As the judge, Anthony Carson, read out her fate, the words, "life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," echoed off the walls, hanging heavily in the air. A hushed silence fell over the room as the words settled in, followed by murmurs and whispers among the spectators. Nyla simply watched, her expression unfazed, her silence an enigma to all who looked her way. Judge Carson, presiding from the bench, allowed his gaze to linger on Nyla for a moment. Something about her demeanor disturbed him. He'd witnessed reactions to severe sentences countless times before, pleas for leniency, disbelief, and anger. But not this calm, stoic acceptance. It felt out of place, as though she had anticipated this outcome all along. It was almost as if she were watching a performance, waiting for the next act to begin. Carson's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something vaguely familiar about her, a shadow of a memory tugging at the edges of his mind, yet he couldn't quite place it. Her composure reminded him of someone he had known years ago, someone who'd taught him the importance of integrity, of standing firm in the face of injustice. That mentor had been Nyla Mitchell, his former Chief Justice, a powerful force in the legal community and one of the most respected voices in the judicial system. But this couldn't be her, he reasoned. That woman had disappeared from public life years ago, lost to rumors of illness or retirement. And yet, the resemblance, the posture, and especially that unbreakable gaze, sent an unsettling feeling through him. Nyla's silence was intentional. She had anticipated every step of this process, crafting a plan over years, perhaps even decades, to bring about a moment that would shake the very foundations of the justice system. She knew how powerful silence could be, how it could cut through the air more sharply than any plea or argument. And in this room, her silence was deliberate, an act as carefully chosen as any word she might have spoken. The gavel struck, punctuating the end of the trial, but Nyla remained composed. She held the eyes of Judge Carson for a moment longer, a subtle recognition passing between them, and in that fleeting glance, she saw the faintest flicker of doubt in his expression. It was a small crack, but Nyla knew that doubt would only grow. She had orchestrated this appearance, her identity obscured but present, ready to plant the seeds that would ultimately unravel the network of corruption she had spent years unraveling from behind the scenes. As the guards came to escort her out of the courtroom, Nyla stood with a quiet dignity, her hands relaxed, her posture unbroken. Her silence unsettled everyone who watched her leave. The attorneys, the reporters, the spectators, all of them exchanged glances, wondering if they had missed something, if this quiet woman knew something they did not. As the prison transport van rumbled along the winding road, Nyla Mitchell stared out the small, barred window, her mind drifting back through years of memories. She was no stranger to justice, having once stood at the pinnacle of the judicial system as a respected Chief Justice. Her reputation was one of unwavering integrity, a rare gem in a system all too willing to bend under the weight of influence and wealth. She remembered her days in the courtroom, commanding the respect of her peers, her decisions shaping lives and changing the course of cases. But those days were behind her now. She had never planned to end up here, in chains, sentenced to a life behind bars. Yet as the van continued its journey, she felt an eerie sense of control, even calm. This was the path she had chosen, a path that had taken years of quiet planning and calculated risk. For Nyla, this conviction wasn't the end but the beginning of her ultimate objective, to expose the corruption that had infected the system she once believed in. Her mind wandered to the first signs of decay she had witnessed. It started as whispers in the halls, small hints of cases with peculiar outcomes, decisions that seemed less about justice and more about favor. At first, she dismissed them as anomalies, isolated instances that couldn't possibly represent a trend. After all, she had worked alongside most of these people, people she thought she could trust, people she had mentored and guided. Yet, the signs grew harder to ignore. One case stood out in particular, a case she had ruled on, only to see it overturned in a lower court, a reversal that should have been impossible. The defendant, a wealthy business magnate, had walked free despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Nyla's gut twisted as she learned that a judge with a questionable record had reversed her ruling, justifying it on dubious legal grounds. But what disturbed her more was what she found next: financial transactions linking that judge to several donors connected to the defendant. She saw, with painful clarity, how justice could be bought and sold. Slowly, Nyla began to see patterns, threads connecting one case to another, like strands in a web. Each bribe, each manipulation, and each favor granted to the powerful marked a growing network of corruption. And at the heart of it all were some of the very people she had trusted. The more she dug, the more she realized the scale of the corruption. What she had first thought were isolated incidents were, in fact, systemic, entrenched deeply within the very structure of the judicial system. But Nyla knew that calling out this corruption would be risky. In a system where money and influence were king, any attempt to expose these deeds could backfire spectacularly, risking not only her career but her life. The people involved were powerful, protected by wealth and status, with connections reaching high into politics, law enforcement, and the judiciary itself. If she were to challenge them openly, she would be silenced. So, Nyla did what no one expected: she disappeared. She stepped back from public life, her retirement quietly announced. Her former colleagues speculated that the pressure of the job had finally taken its toll on her, some even suggesting she had fallen ill. She allowed these rumors to swirl, knowing they served as a convenient cover. Behind the scenes, however, she was far from inactive. She continued her work in the shadows, meticulously gathering evidence on the corrupted officials, carefully documenting every bribe, every manipulation, every abuse of power. She became a ghost, a quiet observer, fading into obscurity while uncovering every dark corner of the system. Her mind flashed back to the meetings she would hold in secret with the few allies she had left, each as committed as she was to unraveling the tangled web of corruption. They shared information cautiously, using coded language and secure channels, fully aware of the risks. They worked late into the night, reviewing financial statements, case records, and sealed court documents. She instructed her confidants to remain anonymous, to distance themselves from her as much as possible. She wanted them protected, even if it meant standing alone in the end. As the van rolled closer to the prison gates, Nyla felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had gathered enough evidence over the years to bring down some of the most powerful people in the justice system. Her sentencing was just another piece of the plan, another step toward the ultimate exposure of these corrupt networks. She knew that once she was inside the prison, the wheel she had set in motion would start to turn, driven by the allies she had left behind on the outside. When the van finally stopped, and the guards approached to escort her inside, Nyla straightened her shoulders and prepared herself for what lay ahead. In the dim, quiet solitude of his chambers, Judge Anthony Carson sat hunched over a thick stack of documents that lay open on his desk. His mind was in turmoil. The confidential file had been delivered to him earlier that day by a nervous young lawyer named Simon, a face he recognized from Nyla Mitchell's recent trial. Carson had thought little of him then, assuming he was simply another novice attorney struggling to find his footing. But now, holding these documents in his hands, Carson felt a weight he hadn't known before, a sickening pull of dread and guilt. Carson ran his eyes over the pages, each line pulling him deeper into the darkness he had long tried to ignore. Names, dates, financial transactions, and cases, all meticulously documented. At first, he struggled to comprehend the sheer scope of it. But the more he read, the more he saw it clearly, the quiet web of corruption he'd overlooked, or perhaps even benefited from, over the years. The file was like a mirror, one that reflected not only his own complicity but also the festering rot within the system he'd once vowed to serve with integrity. As he read on, he was struck by a name he hadn't heard in years: Nyla Mitchell. His mentor. The very woman who had taught him everything he knew about justice and integrity. Carson could hardly reconcile the image he remembered of Nyla, the proud, dedicated Chief Justice who had once guided him through the legal system, with the silent, subdued woman he had sentenced in court just days before. But now, with this evidence before him, he realized her silent acceptance hadn't been resignation, it had been something far more calculated. Nyla hadn't vanished from public life without reason. She had orchestrated her own conviction, allowing herself to be wrongfully sentenced to expose a truth far darker than any he had ever seen in his career. Carson's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There was his own name, listed in transactions he had no memory of approving but had indirectly benefited from, whether he'd known it at the time or not. It stung, a visceral blow to his pride, his reputation, and his belief in his own principles. He had unknowingly become a pawn, a cog in a machine built to favor the powerful and crush the vulnerable. It was difficult to believe that Nyla had known about all of this. For years, she must have been watching, gathering evidence and waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. The Nyla he had admired had indeed never disappeared. Instead, she had retreated into the shadows, tracking every bribe, every compromised decision, and every corrupt official. And now, Carson realized with growing dread, she was using her wrongful conviction as the very weapon to bring them all down. As Carson sat in stunned silence, a deep shame washed over him. He had been so eager to climb the ranks, to earn the respect of his peers, that he had ignored the small, unsettling signs along the way, the favors granted to those who donated to his campaigns, the pressure from influential figures to make lenient rulings, the whispered deals that now felt like stains on his record. Nyla had once warned him that power could corrupt even the most well-intentioned individuals, and he had brushed it off as cynicism. Now, he could see that she had been right. The memory of Nyla's gaze in the courtroom resurfaced, the quiet intensity of it that had left him feeling unsettled. She had looked at him with such calm conviction, almost as if she were seeing right through him. Carson understood now. That look had been a reminder, a silent accusation, and perhaps even a glimmer of hope that he might still do the right thing. He felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, not from Nyla but from himself. He had always prided himself on being a fair judge, a voice of reason in a chaotic world. But now, he was forced to confront the truth. He had allowed himself to be manipulated, to be compromised. He was as much a part of the problem as the corrupt officials Nyla sought to expose. Carson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a chasm of moral failure. He knew that if he chose to ignore this evidence, he would be no better than the people whose names were printed on these pages. But if he acted on it, if he joined Nyla in her fight, he would have to risk everything. His career, his reputation, perhaps even his safety. Yet something deep inside him, some flicker of decency he thought had long since been snuffed out, urged him forward. As the weight of his realization settled over him, Carson felt a renewed sense of purpose, albeit tinged with fear. He knew that to make amends, he would have to confront his own failures and, more importantly, take a stand against the corruption he had once allowed to flourish. Nyla had put herself on the line, sacrificing her freedom to expose the truth. The least he could do was follow her lead, using his influence to begin dismantling the system from within. Steeling himself, Carson picked up the phone and dialed Simon's number, his voice quiet but resolute as he requested a meeting. He could no longer ignore the role he had played in this injustice, nor could he deny that Nyla's mission was, in many ways, his own redemption. He could feel the gravity of the decision he was about to make, a choice that would define his legacy. As he waited for Simon's response, Carson felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of duty, of responsibility not just to the system but to the people it was meant to protect. Nyla had reminded him of that, even if it had taken her silence, her conviction, and the weight of her sacrifice to do so. And now he had a choice, to remain complicit in a system that had failed or to help her dismantle it, piece by painful piece. In the bright lights of the television studio, Simon adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. Across from him sat the host, a sharp-eyed journalist known for her relentless interviews. The cameras were about to start rolling, and Simon was about to reveal the file that could change everything, not just for Nyla, but for the entire justice system. The weight of the documents, neatly bound and ready for presentation, sat heavy in his lap. As the broadcast began, the host wasted no time diving into the topic. "Today, we have a special guest with us," she announced, her gaze unflinching. "Attorney Simon Brooks is here with exclusive information that could reveal the corruption plaguing our judicial system. This evidence pertains to Nyla Mitchell's recent conviction, a conviction that has shocked many. Welcome, Mr. Brooks." Simon cleared his throat. "Thank you. I'm here to speak for Ms. Mitchell, who has been wrongfully sentenced to life in prison without parole. But this story is about more than one woman's fate. What I have here," he said, lifting the file, "contains evidence that Nyla Mitchell gathered over years, evidence of a judicial system rife with corruption, favoritism, and bribery." The host raised her brows, leaning in. "You're saying this evidence directly implicates members of the judiciary?" Simon nodded, his tone steady and calm. "Yes, it implicates high-ranking officials, judges, prosecutors, and others in positions of power who have abused their influence for personal gain. Ms. Mitchell's conviction is just the tip of the iceberg. She's been framed, made into a scapegoat, to cover up the deeper rot within the system. Within minutes, snippets of the interview were flashing across TV screens, phone screens, and social media feeds nationwide. The story spread like wildfire. Headlines blared, "Corruption Scandal Rocks Judiciary and Ex-Chief Justice Nyla Mitchell's Conviction Under Fire." The public's response was immediate and intense, with citizens across the country questioning how such blatant corruption could go unnoticed for so long. The host, sensing the weight of the moment, probed further. "What specific evidence do you have that proves this corruption?" Simon opened the file, carefully displaying a few key documents. "Here are just a few examples," he said, holding up pages with redacted names but with enough detail to stun the viewers. "Here, you can see transaction records, case files, and even internal memos that document favorable rulings for certain defendants in exchange for financial donations. These aren't just accusations. They're supported by concrete evidence Ms. Mitchell herself gathered while she was a Chief Justice." The camera zoomed in, capturing the gravity in Simon's eyes. His tone was resolute. "This is not just about one mistake or one case. This is a pattern, a pervasive culture that has infiltrated our courts and turned justice into a commodity." Almost immediately, social media erupted with outrage. Tweets and posts circulated with hashtags like #JusticeForNyla, #EndJudicialCorruption, and #ReformTheSystem. Viewers shared their disbelief and anger, with comments flooding in by the second. Many expressed horror that a former Chief Justice could be so easily manipulated by a system she had dedicated her life to protecting. Others shared stories of their own experiences with injustice, feeling vindicated that someone was finally speaking out on their behalf. Within hours, news anchors and reporters from other networks were picking up the story, speculating on what this scandal could mean for the judiciary's future. Panel discussions sprang up, with legal experts weighing in on the implications. Many questioned how Nyla could have been convicted based on such weak evidence in the first place. If a respected judge and lawyer like Nyla could be wrongfully convicted, what did it mean for everyday citizens who lacked her resources and expertise? Simon watched the broadcast unfold from the studio, acutely aware of the momentum building. When he had agreed to this interview, he had hoped to make a ripple, but now he was witnessing a wave. The public outrage was exactly what he and Nyla had counted on. They knew that once the truth was out, people wouldn't stand idly by. This was their chance to finally challenge the system. Outside the studio, protesters had already started to gather, holding signs that read "Justice for Nyla" and "No more corrupt courts." News vans lined the streets, cameras capturing the growing crowd as it chanted and called for reform. Simon knew this was just the beginning, and he was determined to capitalize on it. In the days that followed, Simon continued to make appearances, reinforcing Nyla's story and calling for accountability within the justice system. He presented more evidence, revealing how certain cases had been manipulated in exchange for bribes and favors. He outlined how cases had been quietly swept under the rug, how rulings had been altered for the wealthy and influential, and how people without power were systematically sidelined. With each new piece of information, the media frenzy grew more intense, and public trust in the justice system continued to erode. The protesters outside the courthouse grew in numbers each day, their voices joining in a chorus of demands. They called for a review of Nyla's case, for a thorough investigation into the officials involved, and for sweeping reforms to ensure justice was no longer for sale. Even members of the judiciary who had once stood by silently now found themselves under intense scrutiny. Politicians who had long praised the judicial system now faced questions about their affiliations with those implicated in the scandal. Simon's strategic use of the media had forced the story into the national spotlight, and now it was a force that couldn't be ignored. He used every interview and press conference to refocus attention on the fact that Nyla's conviction was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a larger, more insidious problem. "This is not about one woman," Simon emphasized repeatedly. "This is about the integrity of our entire judicial system." Public sentiment surged, and the people demanded answers. Simon's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from journalists, activists, and even some anonymous insiders willing to come forward with information. Several officials within the judiciary quietly reached out to him, hoping to cut deals or negotiate immunity if they provided evidence against their more powerful colleagues. The scandal had taken on a life of its own, spiraling into a national reckoning that the system could no longer contain. In one particular interview, Simon ended with a powerful statement, one that echoed in households and social media feeds across the nation. For too long, the justice system has been a tool for the wealthy and powerful. Nyla Mitchell stood up to that system, and for it, she was silenced. But the silence ends here. This fight is not just for her, but for everyone who has ever been denied justice because they couldn't afford it. As Simon's words reverberated through the country, citizens began calling their representatives, demanding that lawmakers take action. Proposals for judicial reform surfaced in the Senate, and politicians who had long avoided the topic were now forced to take a stand. In a matter of days, Nyla Mitchell's case had sparked a national movement, and people from all walks of life joined in to demand that the corruption be rooted out. Simon knew that Nyla's trial had become more than just about her innocence. It was now a symbol of a larger struggle, a fight for justice that could reshape the nation. He could feel the power of the public's voice, the strength of their outrage, and he knew they had only just begun. As the pressure mounted on the judicial system, Simon prepared for the next steps. He had no intention of stopping until every corrupt official named in Nyla's file was exposed. Nyla's mission was now a shared one, with people across the country rallying behind her cause. In the quiet moments, Simon thought of Nyla sitting in her prison cell, awaiting the day her work would bring about the change she had sacrificed so much for. And with the nation's eyes now fixed firmly on the judiciary, Simon felt confident that they would achieve nothing less than true justice. In the dimly lit room at the visitors' area of the prison, Judge Anthony Carson sat across from Nyla Mitchell, the woman he had sentenced to a lifetime behind bars. The room was cold, sterile, with nothing but a worn wooden table and 2 metal chairs between them. Carson's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together on the table, struggling to keep his composure. He hadn't slept properly in days. The guilt weighed on him heavily, like a stone pressing on his chest, leaving him hollow and uneasy. He had come here today, not out of obligation, but from a need to right his wrongs. Nyla entered, escorted by a guard, her gaze sharp and wary. She sat across from Carson, her expression unreadable, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other in silence. Carson could feel the weight of her scrutiny, and he knew he deserved it. He knew she had every reason to hate him, to distrust every word that might come out of his mouth. But he was here, determined to speak his truth, even if it was far too late. "Nyla," he began softly, his voice faltering as he spoke her name, a name he hadn't said aloud in years, though it had been haunting his thoughts since the trial. She raised an eyebrow, waiting, her silence pressing him to continue. "I came here because I owe you an apology," Carson said, his voice thick with remorse. "For everything. For the way I turned a blind eye, for sentencing you based on what I now understand was a manipulated case. I was part of a system that betrayed you, and I can't let it go on like this." Nyla leaned back, crossing her arms. Her face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a glint of suspicion tempered by curiosity. Carson could sense her calculating, measuring every word he spoke, trying to discern whether he was here out of genuine regret or self-preservation. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Carson continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know that I didn't realize how deep this went. Not until I saw the evidence, your files. The corruption you've exposed," he paused, shaking his head. "I was blind to it, willingly so. I wanted to believe in the system, to believe that we were serving justice. But I see now how wrong I was." Nyla watched him in silence, her gaze sharp and assessing. Finally she spoke, her tone laced with an edge that made Carson flinch. "You were willing to see what you wanted to see, Anthony. That's what all of you did. And now that the truth has come out, you want to make amends." Her words cut through him, and he swallowed, feeling the sting of her accusation. She was right. He had chosen to ignore the signs, to believe that his role within the system made him untouchable, that he was above the corruption. And now, faced with the reality of his complicity, he felt unworthy of even sitting before her. "Yes," Carson admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I want to make amends. But it's more than that, Nyla. I want to help bring down those who have twisted the system. You've exposed them, but the work isn't finished. I can help. I know these people, their networks, their habits. I can be useful to you, if you'll let me." Nyla held his gaze, her eyes narrowing. She was silent for a long time, as if weighing his words, searching for any hint of deceit. Carson felt his heart pounding, fearing she would refuse, knowing he deserved it if she did. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice low and measured. "You're right. I don't trust you," she said, her tone unwavering. "You were part of the system that tried to bury me. You stood by as they twisted justice to suit their own ends. And now, only after being confronted with undeniable proof, you decide to take a stand. You've lost everything to protect, and that makes you dangerous. But," she paused, her gaze softening just a fraction, "if you're truly here to help, then maybe there's a way forward." Carson nodded, relief flooding through him. He had come here expecting her anger, her distrust, and her accusations. But he had also come here hoping, desperately, that she would give him a chance to redeem himself. He could see now that she was willing, albeit cautiously, to accept his help. "I understand," he said softly. "And I don't expect you to trust me right away. I'll prove myself if you'll let me." She looked at him intently, the weight of her years of sacrifice and betrayal evident in her eyes. "What's changed, Anthony?" she asked, her tone almost curious. "Why are you here now?" He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because I see now how wrong I was. The evidence you gathered, the corruption, it shattered my faith in the system I've served my whole life. I can't go back to that, pretending it doesn't exist. And because you were my mentor, Nyla. You taught me what justice is supposed to be. I failed you, and I want to make it right." For the first time, a faint glimmer of understanding crossed her expression. She nodded slowly, as if accepting the depths of his regret. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "But this alliance isn't about redemption. It's about justice. If you're serious about helping, I'll use every bit of knowledge you have. But know this, Anthony, I won't let you drag me down with you if you falter." Carson nodded solemnly, understanding the terms she was laying out. "I wouldn't ask you to. I'm ready to face whatever comes of this." They sat in silence for a moment, both aware of the fragile, tentative alliance forming between them. Carson could see that Nyla wasn't ready to forgive him, but she was willing to use his expertise. And he was willing to give her everything he had. As they stood to leave, Carson felt a strange sense of clarity. This was his chance to begin making amends, to finally be the judge he had always aspired to be. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger and that their alliance would be strained by mistrust and years of betrayal. But as he left the room, he felt a flicker of hope, a small but significant step toward redemption. The room was packed with journalists, cameras flashing, pens scribbling furiously as Simon stepped up to the podium. Behind him, Nyla stood tall and composed, a quiet force that seemed to command attention. To her left, Judge Anthony Carson waited, his usually confident demeanor shadowed by a mix of guilt and determination. For weeks, the public had heard rumors, caught glimpses of Nyla's story. But now, the truth was about to be laid bare for everyone to see. Simon adjusted the microphone, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today. We have gathered to reveal the truth that many have long suspected but have been unable to prove until now." He glanced back at Nyla, who gave him a small nod, urging him forward. "This is not just about the wrongful conviction of Nyla Mitchell. It's about a judicial system that has been corrupted from within, a system that has served the interests of the powerful at the expense of justice itself." The air was thick with anticipation. Journalists leaned forward, their cameras zooming in, ready to capture every word. Simon opened the thick file in his hands, flipping to the first page, where a series of names were listed. Over the past several years, Ms. Mitchell, a former Chief Justice herself, has uncovered undeniable evidence of corruption within our courts. Today, we will share some of this evidence that exposes a network of bribed officials, manipulated verdicts, and a system that has betrayed the very people it was meant to protect. The first document he held up to the cameras was a transaction record, a large sum of money transferred to a judge's private account just days before he had overturned a conviction for a high-profile businessman. The journalists murmured, some exchanging shocked glances, others scribbling furiously. "Here," Simon continued, "we have records of bribes, of payments made to judges in exchange for favorable rulings. This isn't speculation, this is fact. These payments weren't isolated incidents but part of a systematic scheme, where wealth and influence bought freedom and leniency." He gestured to the projector screen beside him, where copies of the documents were displayed for all to see, transaction records, emails, and confidential memos exchanged between officials discussing cases like commodities. It was irrefutable, damning evidence, and the room buzzed with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Then Nyla stepped forward, her gaze steady as she scanned the room, each word carrying the weight of someone who had sacrificed everything to expose this truth. For years, I dedicated my life to upholding justice. I believed in the integrity of the system. But what I found was a network of corruption that spanned across the judiciary, reaching into the offices of respected officials, even those I once called colleagues. Her voice softened, a tone of restrained anger and sorrow. This is not just about me. I am not the only one who has suffered because of this broken system. I am just one victim among countless others, ordinary people who don't have the means or the power to fight back. They have been silenced, overlooked, and betrayed by those who swore to protect them. The silence in the room was palpable as Nyla's words sunk in. She had been wrongfully convicted, but she was standing here, not just for herself but for everyone failed by a corrupt system. This wasn't just her battle anymore, it was a battle for justice itself. Carson took a breath, stepping forward, and the reporters turned their attention to him. He looked older, wearier, as though the weight of his actions had taken a physical toll on him. His voice was quiet but resolute. I stand before you today not only as a judge but as a man who failed to see the truth. I was a part of this system, complicit in its failures. I let ambition cloud my judgment. But now, I am here to make things right. I'm here to support Nyla and to ensure that this corruption is eradicated. The room erupted in murmurs, some journalists whispering incredulously. A judge admitting his own faults, exposing his complicity, it was a rare sight. But Carson's presence, his willingness to take responsibility, only added fuel to the fire. The story had taken on a new dimension, becoming not only about corruption but about accountability, about those in power finally facing the consequences of their actions. Simon continued, presenting more evidence, each document more damning than the last. They showcased emails in which judges discussed rulings before trials had even begun, colluding with powerful figures who promised them financial gain. Cases involving corporations, influential businessmen, and even politicians were shown to have been manipulated, their outcomes determined not by the facts or the law but by the weight of wealth and influence. As each piece of evidence was unveiled, the outrage in the room grew. Journalists fired off questions, their voices mingling with each other, creating a chorus of anger and disbelief. "How many officials are involved in this?" one journalist demanded, her face pale with shock. "Will these judges face prosecution?" another called out. Simon raised his hand, quieting the room. "We have identified numerous officials, judges, and prosecutors involved in this corruption. It is now up to law enforcement to take the next steps. We demand a full investigation, not only into Nyla's wrongful conviction but into every case touched by this corruption." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the crowd. "This isn't just about justice for Nyla. This is about ensuring that every citizen can believe in the fairness of our judicial system. The people deserve to know that justice cannot be bought." Nyla stepped forward once more, her voice calm but resolute. "I did not come here today to ask for sympathy. I came here to demand accountability. To tell you that the time for reform is now. We must tear down the structures that have allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. We owe it to every citizen who has been wronged, who has lost faith in the very system meant to protect them." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, as though they were calling for justice from the very walls of the building. There was a fire in her eyes that resonated with every person in the room, a conviction that could not be ignored. Suddenly, questions came pouring in again, voices competing to be heard. The press conference had become a storm of questions and demands, and it was clear that the public would not rest until answers were given. "Ms. Mitchell, do you believe there are still others in power protecting this corruption?" one reporter asked. "Yes," Nyla replied firmly. "There are those who have profited from this system, who will fight to protect it. But I am here to ensure they will not succeed. This is a fight for justice, and it will not end here." The press conference went on, with Simon, Nyla, and Carson responding to questions, their message ringing clear: justice must prevail. They called on the public to stay engaged, to demand transparency, to stand with them in the call for reform. The atmosphere was electric, filled with an energy that seemed to promise change. As the conference concluded, the journalists hurried out, eager to break the story that was already spreading like wildfire. Social media erupted, news outlets flashed headlines, and the public response was immediate. People took to the streets in protest, demanding accountability, refusing to let this story fade into the background. In the days that followed, Nyla's words echoed across the nation. Citizens marched, chanted, and held signs that bore her message: justice for all, reform now. Calls flooded the offices of lawmakers, demanding that they address the corruption exposed. The ripple effects of Nyla's revelations were undeniable, reaching far beyond the courtroom and igniting a national movement. Nyla, Simon, and Carson knew that the battle was just beginning, but they were ready. The tide had turned, and now, with the public support, they had the strength to face the powerful forces that would undoubtedly try to stop them. But as they left the press conference that day, each of them felt the undeniable shift. The system would never be the same again. The days following the press conference were a blur of intensity and tension. Nyla's story had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the nation, but with that attention came a dark undercurrent: threats, intimidation, and the lurking danger of retaliation. Nyla knew this was inevitable. She had exposed powerful people, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. It started with anonymous phone calls. First, they were just late at night, the line silent except for the sound of someone breathing. Then, more direct messages came through. A letter arrived at Simon's office, hand-delivered and without a return address. Inside, a single line was scrawled in heavy black ink: drop this, or face the consequences. Simon glanced at Nyla, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. "They're getting desperate," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. Nyla looked at the letter without flinching, her face set with a resolve that had become as familiar as her own shadow. "They think they can intimidate us," she replied calmly. "But this only proves we're getting closer to something they don't want exposed." Soon after, Carson received a similar threat. It was left on his car windshield, a plain white envelope with his name scrawled across it. Inside, the note was blunt: "Stay out of this, or you'll be sorry." He felt a chill run down his spine, but he knew that retreating was no longer an option. If anything, it pushed him closer to Nyla's cause. For too long, he had been silent in the face of injustice, and now he was ready to face whatever came his way, even if it meant standing on the front lines. As the threats mounted, Nyla, Simon, and Carson gathered in the safety of Simon's office late one evening, their voices low as they discussed the risks they were now facing. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls as they mapped out their next move. "We need to be strategic," Simon said, laying out a stack of files on the table. "They're not going to let us keep uncovering evidence without pushing back. We can expect more intimidation, maybe even worse." Carson nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "They'll do everything they can to protect themselves. We're dealing with people who have hidden behind their power for years. They're used to winning, to silencing anyone who stands in their way." Nyla leaned forward, her gaze fierce. "Then we don't give them the chance. We need to act quickly, to stay ahead of them. We've already gathered enough evidence to expose even more officials, judges, attorneys, politicians. They've been hiding in plain sight, but we can bring them down. We just have to be one step ahead." As they discussed their strategy, Nyla felt a surge of resolve stronger than ever before. She had spent years gathering the evidence, planning for this very moment, and no amount of intimidation would make her back down now. She thought of the people who had been silenced, who had suffered because of a corrupt system that crushed anyone in its way. She was determined to see this fight through, not just for herself, but for all of them. In the following days, the threats continued to escalate. Nyla noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside her apartment at odd hours, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Once, as she left the courthouse, she caught sight of a man watching her from across the street. He wore dark sunglasses and quickly looked away when he noticed her gaze. Nyla's heart raced, but she refused to let fear control her. She tightened her grip on her bag and walked on, her head held high. Simon took additional precautions, increasing security at his office and warning his staff to be cautious. Carson, too, found himself looking over his shoulder, but every moment of fear only deepened his resolve. They had committed to this path, and they wouldn't turn back. One evening, as Nyla returned to her apartment, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up, her hand steady as she opened it. Inside was a photograph of herself taken from across the street. The message beneath it read, "This is your last warning." She clenched her jaw, feeling a mixture of anger and determination wash over her. This wasn't just a threat, It was a challenge. They wanted to intimidate her, to make her feel vulnerable and alone. But she was not alone, and she would not be frightened into silence. The next morning, she met with Simon and Carson at a cafe, keeping her voice low as she described the photograph. Carson's face hardened, and Simon placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They want us to feel trapped," he said. "But we're closer than ever. We just need to stay focused and trust that we're on the right side of this fight." Nyla nodded, her gaze steady. "They can try to scare us, but we're not backing down. We have more evidence, and it's time to make it public." Together, they crafted a plan to release the next wave of information. This time, they would go further, detailing specific cases that had been manipulated, naming individuals who had used their power to profit at the expense of justice. Nyla knew that with each step, the risks would grow, but so would their impact. As the night wore on, they prepared everything, organizing files, coordinating with trusted journalists who had pledged to help them reveal the truth. Carson used his insider knowledge to identify weak points in the network, advising them on how to present the evidence in a way that would be undeniable. Every detail mattered now. They had to make sure that once the truth was out, it could not be buried. Finally, as they wrapped up their plans, Nyla looked at her allies, the two men who had stood by her despite the mounting dangers. "This isn't just about exposing corruption," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's about proving that justice is worth fighting for. No matter what they throw at us, we can't lose sight of why we started this." Simon and Carson nodded, each of them feeling the weight of her words. They knew that this battle was no longer just a matter of legality. It had become a fight for the very soul of the justice system. And together, they would see it through, undeterred by the threats that loomed in the shadows. As they left that evening, each of them took extra precautions, but their determination remained unshaken. The system might try to silence them, but they had seen too much, sacrificed too much to turn back now. And with every new day, every fresh threat, they grew stronger, more certain that they were on the right path. The road ahead would be treacherous, but they were ready. For every attempt to intimidate them, they would answer with more evidence, with louder voices, with an unbreakable will. The battle for justice had only just begun, and they would not stop until the truth was brought to light. Late one night, as Simon sat in his office poring over files, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, his mind too engrossed in the evidence he and Nyla had been working tirelessly to compile. But something made him pick it up, and as he answered, a low, cautious voice greeted him. "Mr. Simon, I'm reaching out because I have information that may be useful to you and Ms. Mitchell," the voice said. Simon's pulse quickened. In his line of work, anonymous calls were nothing new, but this was different. The person on the other end sounded tense, as though they were watching their back with every word. "I work within the Justice Department," the caller continued, "and I have proof, documents, emails, recordings, connecting high-ranking officials to what Ms. Mitchell has exposed." Simon's heart raced, his grip on the phone tightening. They had been seeking concrete evidence, something that could validate the connections they had already uncovered. "Who are you?" Simon asked cautiously. The caller hesitated, then answered, "Let's just say I'm someone who believes in justice, a concept that's been corrupted for too long. But this information is dangerous, Mr. Simon. If it reaches the wrong hands, it could put both of us at risk." Simon's mind was spinning, already calculating the potential this evidence could hold. "Where can we meet?" he asked, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. He scribbled down a location, a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, and a time. The caller's voice was calm, but Simon sensed the urgency, the fear beneath the surface. "Come alone," the caller instructed. "And tell no one. There are people watching." Simon knew he couldn't keep this from Nyla, however, and later that night, he filled her in on the mysterious call. She listened intently, her gaze sharpening with each detail. "This could be the break we need," she said quietly, a hint of hope in her voice. Together, they agreed on a plan. Simon would go to the meeting, but Nyla and Carson would wait nearby in case anything went wrong. They were all aware of the danger, but the promise of new evidence was too vital to ignore. The next evening, Simon arrived at the dimly lit diner, his eyes scanning the empty booths and shadowed corners. He took a seat near the back, feeling the familiar tension settle over him as he waited. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally, a figure slipped into the booth across from him, their face obscured by the shadow of a hoodie. The figure glanced around, visibly on edge. "Are you Simon?" they whispered, eyes darting around the room. "Yes," Simon replied, keeping his voice low. "I understand you have information that could help us." The whistleblower nodded, pulling a worn envelope from inside their jacket. "This," they said, sliding it across the table, "is everything I have. Emails linking officials to bribery, transcripts of private conversations, and a list of names, people who have profited from this corruption. Some of these names are ones you'll recognize. They're in positions of influence." Simon opened the envelope just enough to glimpse the stack of papers within. His heart pounded as he saw dates, names, even bank account numbers, an intricate web of deceit laid out in ink. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, looking up at the whistleblower. They hesitated, eyes shadowed with fear. "I can't be a part of it anymore. I went into this job believing in justice, in protecting people. But I've seen too much, and I can't stay silent while innocent people are punished to serve someone else's agenda." Simon felt a surge of admiration for this person's courage. But before he could respond, he sensed a shift in the room. A group of men entered the diner, their eyes scanning the booths. Simon's blood ran cold. These were not ordinary patrons. The whistleblower stiffened, their face paling. "They found us," they whispered, their voice tight with panic. Simon glanced around, his mind racing. He had to get the whistleblower out safely. "Follow me," he murmured, pocketing the envelope and signaling for them to stay close. They slipped out of the booth and made their way toward the rear exit, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. But as they neared the door, one of the men spotted them, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Hey!" he shouted, starting toward them. Simon grabbed the whistleblower's arm, pulling them through the exit and into the alley. They ran, their footsteps echoing off the brick walls as they darted around corners, desperately trying to evade their pursuers. Outside, Nyla and Carson were waiting in a parked car down the street, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. When they saw Simon and the whistleblower sprinting toward them, closely followed by the men from the diner, Nyla's eyes widened. "Go!" she shouted to Carson, and he hit the gas, pulling up beside them just as Simon and the whistleblower reached the curb. "Get in!" Carson yelled, and Simon practically shoved the whistleblower into the back seat before diving in himself. The car peeled away from the curb, the tires screeching as they sped down the street. Nyla glanced back, watching the figures recede in the distance. For a moment, silence filled the car as they caught their breath, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. The whistleblower sat trembling, clutching the envelope as if it were a lifeline. Simon placed a reassuring hand on their shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We'll make sure this information reaches the right people." The whistleblower took a shaky breath, nodding. "I never realized just how dangerous this was. They'll come after me now." Nyla turned, her gaze steady. "We'll protect you," she promised. "But what you've done here, it's more powerful than any threat they could make. They may be ruthless, but truth is stronger." As they drove back to their safe location, they reviewed the envelope's contents by the dim light of the car's interior. Each page revealed another layer of corruption, the names and actions of powerful officials who had manipulated justice to suit their own interests. Bank transfers from shadowed accounts, confidential email threads, every piece of evidence was meticulously detailed. With each new revelation, the weight of the conspiracy became clearer, and so did the realization of what they were up against. But the whistleblower had given them exactly what they needed: undeniable proof, a link that connected the officials to their crimes in a way that could no longer be denied. Back at their safe house, they organized the evidence, carefully cataloging every document, preparing it for a release that would expose these officials once and for all. The whistleblower sat nearby, their face drawn but resolute. They knew their life would never be the same after this, but the courage in their eyes told Nyla everything she needed to know. They were ready to stand by their actions. As they wrapped up their preparations, Simon looked at Nyla and Carson. "This is it. Once we go public with this, there's no going back." Nyla's eyes flashed with a fierce determination. "That's exactly what we want," she replied. "They can try to silence us, but they can't silence the truth." The whistleblower met Nyla's gaze, a flicker of gratitude in their weary expression. "Thank you," they said quietly, "for believing in justice, even when it seemed impossible." Nyla placed a hand on their shoulder, her voice firm. "We're in this together. You've done something incredible today, something that will change everything." As dawn broke, Casting a warm glow over the city, they finalized their plans. They would take this evidence to the public, to every journalist, activist, and ally who would listen. With the whistleblowers' courage and their own resolve, they were ready to expose the rot that had festered for too long. The battle was far from over, but as they looked at the mountain of evidence before them, they knew they had a fighting chance. Together, they would see justice served, not just for Nyla, but for everyone who had suffered under the weight of corruption. The day of the final press conference arrived with an air of anticipation that was almost tangible. News of Nyla's fight had spread across the country, and the venue was packed with reporters, activists, supporters, and even those who had previously been skeptical. The press conference was more than a call for justice. It was the climactic moment of Nyla's journey, a chance to expose the truth with undeniable proof and to demand systemic change. As Nyla stepped onto the stage, the cameras flashed, capturing the moment with an intensity that mirrored the crowd's emotions. Behind her stood Simon, Carson, and a coalition of activists who had rallied around her cause, each of them symbolizing the unity and strength of a movement that had grown from her struggle. Taking a deep breath, Nyla adjusted the microphone, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. She felt the weight of the moment, knowing that every word she spoke could ignite change, or be swiftly suppressed. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady yet filled with resolve. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her tone calm yet charged with purpose. "Today, we stand together to reveal the truth, to confront the corruption that has plagued our justice system for far too long. This is not just about my story. It's about every person who has suffered under a system that was designed to protect, but has instead betrayed us all." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Nyla raised a thick folder, the documents inside representing months of tireless work, risk, and sacrifice. "In my hands, I hold evidence, proof of the crimes committed by those who are supposed to uphold justice." She turned to the projector beside her, where an image of the first document appeared, magnified for all to see. "Here, we have records of financial transactions," she continued, her voice unyielding. "Money exchanged between high-ranking officials and influential figures, individuals who have manipulated our courts, stolen people's lives, and bought verdicts like commodities." She clicked to the next image, showing emails between judges and corporate executives, discussing verdicts before trials had even begun. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every detail, and activists in the back nodded, expressions of solidarity on their faces. Nyla's voice grew stronger as she delved deeper into the evidence, laying out the layers of corruption, each revelation more shocking than the last. "These aren't isolated incidents," she said, her gaze piercing as she addressed the crowd. "This is a network, a web of corruption that has twisted our justice system into a tool for the powerful, leaving ordinary people to suffer in silence. But today, we're tearing down that web. Today, we're demanding justice." As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had started as a press conference had transformed into a rallying cry, a call to action that was resonating with everyone present. The crowd was no longer just an audience. They were becoming participants in the demand for change, their faces filled with anger and determination. Nyla glanced at Simon and Carson, each of them giving her a small nod, silently urging her forward. She felt a surge of courage, a sense that they were truly on the brink of something transformative. But just as she was about to continue, a commotion stirred near the back of the room. A group of men in suits, who had been lurking in the shadows, pushed forward, making their way toward the stage. Their expressions were cold, their intentions clear. They were here to silence her. The tension in the room spiked as one of them, a man with a steely gaze and an air of authority, stepped forward, pointing a finger at Nyla. "You have no right to make these accusations," he said, his voice laced with intimidation. "This so-called evidence is nothing but a desperate attempt to undermine the integrity of our legal system." Nyla met his gaze, unwavering. "Integrity," she replied, her voice echoing through the hall. "What integrity is left when verdicts are bought and justice is for sale? The people deserve to know the truth, and that's what I'm here to give them." The crowd began to murmur, voices of support and anger mixing as the tension grew. Nyla's supporters in the audience stepped forward, their presence emboldening her even as the powerful figures tried to intimidate her into silence. Another voice rose from the crowd, a young woman who had been following Nyla's story from the beginning. "Let her speak," she called out, her voice filled with defiance. The crowd echoed her sentiment, their voices rising in a powerful wave of support. Let her speak. Let her speak. The officials hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered, their authority waning in the face of public outcry. Nyla seized the moment, her voice ringing out above the noise. Today, we stand not just for me, but for every person who has been betrayed by this system. We demand accountability, we demand transparency, and we demand that those responsible be held to the same standards of justice they swore to uphold. She turned back to the projector, clicking to the next slide, a damning list of names, each one belonging to a judge, prosecutor, or public official who had been implicated in the corruption. Gasps echoed through the hall as people recognized the names, names that had once represented authority and trust but now stood as symbols of betrayal. The crowd surged, some shouting for justice, others chanting Nyla's name. The powerful figures who had tried to silence her began to retreat, their faces pale as the crowd grew louder, their calls for reform shaking the walls of the building. With her voice firm and clear, Nyla pressed on. This is just the beginning. We won't stop until every last corrupted official is held accountable, until our justice system is truly reformed. This fight is for all of us, for every person who believes in justice, for every victim of this broken system. She raised her hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet. We are stronger together. And together, we will make sure that this corruption is dismantled, that the voices silenced by fear and oppression are finally heard. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices united in a resounding cry for justice. Journalists captured every moment, their cameras flashing, their pens recording the birth of a movement that had been ignited by one woman's courage. Nyla stood tall, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and determination, knowing that this moment was only the beginning. Just as the press conference began to wind down, Nyla saw Simon step forward, his hand raised to signal one last message. We're calling on every citizen, every person who believes in justice, to join us. This is a fight that belongs to all of us, and we need your voices, your strength, to see it through. Nyla's eyes met Carson's, and in that shared glance, they felt the enormity of what they had accomplished. They had stood up against a system designed to silence them, and they had won the first battle in what would be a long war. As they left the stage, the crowd still chanting and cheering, Nyla knew that their voices would not be silenced. They had demanded change, and now the world was watching. For the first time, Nyla felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She was no longer alone. She was part of something greater, a movement that would not rest until justice was restored. And as she walked out into the light, surrounded by allies and supporters, she knew that they were finally ready to face whatever came next. The fight was far from over, but the spirit of justice was alive, and Nyla was prepared to see it through to the end. As the days turned into weeks, Nyla's story swept across the nation, sparking a movement that no one could have anticipated. Her resilience and determination became a rallying cry for justice, inspiring people from all walks of life to demand accountability and transparency from those in power. News outlets chronicled her journey, framing her not just as a survivor of a corrupt system but as a beacon of hope, a symbol of justice for countless others who had suffered in silence. Despite the rising threats, Nyla remained undeterred. She stood tall in the face of intimidation, her unwavering commitment becoming a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Support poured in from all over the country, letters of gratitude, messages of solidarity, and countless voices joining hers in the call for reform. Where once she had been alone, she now found herself surrounded by allies and advocates, each one emboldened by her courage. Her case soon led to a full-scale investigation, a historic inquiry that shook the very foundations of the judicial system. Officials who had long operated with impunity now faced intense scrutiny, and names once synonymous with power and influence found themselves exposed under the harsh light of truth. As investigation after investigation unfolded, Nyla's fight uncovered an intricate web of corruption that stretched far beyond her own experience. In courtrooms and cities across the country, people began to challenge the systems they had once trusted implicitly. Nyla's fight was no longer just her own, it was a fight that belonged to the nation, a collective push to rebuild a justice system that had failed its citizens for too long. Nyla continued to speak at rallies and community gatherings, her voice reaching people who had never imagined they could stand up to authority. Justice is not just a word, she would tell the crowds, her tone fierce and unyielding. It's a promise that should be fulfilled for everyone, not just those with money or influence. We're here to ensure that no one has to suffer alone, that every voice is heard. Her message echoed far and wide, and her story became a reminder of the power of integrity, of the importance of standing up against corruption, no matter the risks. Nyla had put everything on the line, and in doing so, she had ignited a movement that would not be silenced. As she concluded each speech, she would leave her audience with a powerful call to action. This fight is not just mine. It's yours. Stand with me. Stand for justice. Stand for the truth. And as people took up her call, it became clear that her fight was a turning point, not just for her own case but for the very soul of the nation. Nyla's journey served as a powerful reminder that change begins with one voice, one action, and that together, even the most entrenched injustices can be dismantled. Nyla's story, once one of pain and betrayal, had transformed into a legacy of resilience and hope. The movement she inspired continued to grow, proof that courage, when met with unity, could change the world. And through it all, Nyla stood as a symbol, a living testament to the power of truth and the enduring spirit of justice. In the end, Nyla's story is more than just a personal victory, it's a call for systemic change. Through her courage, she exposes how silence can be the strongest weapon against injustice. Thank you for watching Life Story 999. Please like, comment on your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and redemption.